Today on Crash Course World History, I'm Bryson Saunders, and I'm going to be talking about the Vietnam War. Alright, the Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War, was a fight between North Vietnam, China, and the Soviet Union against the US, Philippines, and other anti-communist countries. The war lasted nearly 20 years, from November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975. The fight was for communism. The war really started because the U.S. wanted to prevent the spread of communism from the results of Communist Russia, China, and North Korea. Events like the fall of Dien Bien Phu, Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Communist offensive of Tet, U.S. military troops leaving, and the fall of Saigon result in a bloody war in Vietnam, with the ending result of North and South Vietnam reuniting, concluding this long-lasting war. Fall of Dien Bien Phu. On May 7, 1954, Dien Bien Phu falls into possession of the Viet Minh. Earlier in March, 40,000 other troops had surrounded 15,000 French soldiers, sieging the French. The Viet Minh troops had been fighting a long war with French for control of Vietnam since 1946. Trying to deceive the other side, French General Navarre put the French force 200 miles behind enemy lines in an area near the Laotian border. He had planned to draw the communists into a battle in which he hoped better French firepower would destroy the enemy, but he greatly underestimated the other side. Viet Minh General Giap had artillery and trenches surrounding mountains and had 5 groups around the French. The battle began with a massive Viet Minh artillery shots. The French quickly lost the upper hand of the battle. Fierce fighting continued to go until the Viet Minh overran the last French positions. During the siege, 1,600 French troops were killed, 4,800 were wounded, and 1,600 missing. The Viet Minh captured 8,000 French. Viet Minh casualties were estimated at approximately 7,900 killed and 15,000 wounded. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu concluded with the end of French involvement in Southeast Asia. France had lost more than 35,000 men and 48,000 had been wounded in war. This led to the agreement to the independence of Vietnam at the Geneva Conference in 1954. Vietnam was no longer a French colony. Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, August 7, 1964, gave congressional approval for expansion of the Vietnam War. During the spring of 1964, military planners had created a plan for major attacks in the north, but at that time President Lyndon B. Johnson were worried that the public would not support the war. By summer, however, the rebels had gotten control of over nearly half of South Vietnam. President Johnson was criticized for not pursuing the war more aggressively. On August 2nd, after a raid on the North Vietnam coast by South Vietnam gunboats, the U.S. destroyer Maddox was fired on by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Johnson soon began to authorize airstrikes against North Vietnam. The next day, he accused the North Vietnamese of open aggression on the high seas. Then he submitted to the Senate a resolution that authorized him to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attacks against the forces of the United States and to prevent any further attacks. The resolution was quickly approved by Congress. Communist Offensive of Tet. On January 31st, 1968, about 70,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched the Tet Offensive, an organized series of attacks on more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. General Vo Giap, leader of the PAVN, planned the attack in an attempt both to promote rebellion among the South Vietnam people and to encourage the United States to lessen its support of the Saigon ruling government. Though U.S. and South Vietnamese forces managed to hold off the communist attacks, news coverage of the attacks shocked the American public and further took away support for the war effort. Despite many casualties, North Vietnam achieved a victory with the Tet Offensive, as the attack set a turning point in the Vietnam War. It also marked the beginning of the American withdrawal from the region. U.S. withdrawals from Vietnam. 2 months after the signing of the Vietnam Peace Agreement, the last U.S. combat troops left South Vietnam as Hanoi freed the remaining American prisoners of war held in North Vietnam. America's 8-year involvement in the Vietnam War was at an end. With the South Vietnamese government crumbling, President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered limiting bomber raids on North Vietnam, and Congress authorized the use of U.S. troops. By 1965, North Vietnamese offensive left President Johnson with 2 choices: increase U.S. involvement or withdraw. Johnson ordered the increase in troop levels soon raised to more than 300,000 as U.S. Air Forces launched the largest bombing campaign in history. During the next few years, the extended length of the war and the high number of U.S. casualties helped turn many people in the U.S. against the Vietnam War. The Communist Tet Offensive of 1968 crushed U.S. hopes of a quick end to the war. In the spring of 1969, as protests against the war increased in the U.S. troop strength in Vietnam reached its top at nearly 550,000 men. Richard Nixon, the new U.S. president, began U.S. troop withdrawal, but he intensified bombing. Large U.S. troop withdrawals continued in the early 1970s. In January 1973, representatives of the United States in North and South Vietnam and the Viet Cong signed a peace agreement in Paris, ending the direct U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War. It included a ceasefire throughout Vietnam, the withdrawal of U.S. forces, the release of prisoners of war, and the reunification of North and South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government was to remain in place until new elections were held, and North Vietnamese forces in the South were not to advance further nor be reinforced. However, even before the last American troops departed on March 29th, the Communists violated the ceasefire, and by early 1974, full-scale war had started again. At the end of 1974, South Vietnamese authorities reported that 80,000 of their soldiers and civilians had been killed in fighting during the year, making it the costliest year of the war. On April 30th, 1975, the last few Americans still in South Vietnam were taken out of the country, South Vietnam, and then surrendered. Fall of Saigon. Saigon, the capital city of South Vietnam, fell to the North Vietnamese on April 30th, 1975. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War. U.S. military in South Vietnam had been reduced greatly, leaving the military of South Vietnam to defend their country against the North. By 1975, the little that remained of the South Vietnamese army wasn't capable of holding off the North, and it was likely that Saigon would fall to the Communist forces. Because Saigon was so far to the south, it escaped most action and damage from the north. However, once U.S. forces had left South Vietnam, the advance of the north into the south became unstoppable. In April, the first bombs in nearly 10 years landed on Saigon. The city had very little defense against them. North Vietnamese smashed down the gates of the President Palace to accept the surrender of gentlemen for South Vietnam. By the end of April 30th, South Vietnam was under complete control of North Vietnam, who announced the creation of a unified Vietnam. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The Vietnam War was the longest foreign war in U.S. history and cost 58,000 American lives. As many as 2 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians were killed. And now to the open letter. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, thanks, Stan. A Vietnam flag. Dear Communism, yes, you may have been such a great power in the past, and yes, you do make everything equal among your people, but really the country just becomes a mess. The leaders just want power and not what's good for the country. Taking out the spread between the low and high class doesn't make up for all the wars you've started. I mean, look at all the people that have died in the Vietnam War because you exist as a government type. I advise you to change to democracy and give people rights to live and stay in control of their economy. Sincerely, Bryson Saunders.